This is your Unit 5 review video. The main topics covered will be the Enlightenment, the Atlantic Revolutions, and the Industrial Revolution. These are the Princeton review pages that are aligned with this review video. I expect you to go back and read them, especially if you want that 5. The Enlightenment, what was it? It was a 17th and 18th century philosophical and intellectual revolution. Enlightenment thought, particularly political philosophy, political Enlightenment thought, focused on the role of humankind and government. Some of the consequences of the Enlightenment are it led to the age of isms. There's a lot of ideologies in this period. Remember, ideologies are action-oriented belief systems. Take a look at the list below. And it also led to challenges and political revolutions. Enlightenment ideas challenged existing political authorities such as monarchs and the church. The Enlightenment was an intellectual revolution that was nominally European. It had effects all across the world, in particular in the New World. It led to all kinds of political revolutions. Two major Enlightenment political thinkers, political philosophers, were Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. They were both social contract theorists, and I'm going to discuss the importance of social contract theory yet again. Thomas Hobbes was the first social contract theorist who wrote The Leviathan, and basically his research question centered on where did political legitimacy and government come from? What gave them the right to rule over us, right? What gives governments the right to rule over the people that they rule over? Hugely important philosophical question and political question that still entertains us today, but it had been answered for centuries in Europe as what gives the right of the government to rule over you? Well, it's God. God, in the so-called divine right to rule, gave the king the divine right to rule over you. Hobbes just doesn't buy this. He says that before there was government, he theorizes that governments originated in a so-called state of nature. And in a state of nature, life was nasty, brutish, and short. Of course, states of nature didn't actually exist. I provide you with a theory of state development in the Unit 1 and 2 video. But nonetheless, let's go with Hobbes' theory because Hobbes' theory doesn't have an important impact for us as historians, um, yet it has an impact in how people interpret his theory and act upon his theory of legitimacy. So Hobbes says before government, people are in a state of nature where it's anarchical, and yeah, you could get whatever you want, you could do whatever you want, but what's to stop someone else from slitting your throat in the night? So like I could, like if theory, I wanted to go to the store. I like to shop at Banana Republic and wanted to get all the Banana Republic clothes I wanted. I could do that, but what's to stop somebody from slitting my throat at night and stealing all those clothes? That's probably a bad example, but yeah, so that's people would enter into a social contract and then institute governments to protect their rights. Hobbes, although was a monarchist, so this actually had a profound impact on the authority of monarchs, especially in the New World when these ideas later spread, um, because it implied if monarchs didn't get their authority from God, instead got their authority from the people maybe hundreds, thousands of years ago, whenever this fictional state of nature existed, it implied that the monarchs could be overthrown if they failed to protect the rights of their people. This is a complicated concept in political philosophy. I urge you to watch the Yale professor lecture about it in the description. She does a much better job of explaining it. Other political theorists like John Locke take Hobbes' social contract theory a step further, and Hobbes, for his take, adds natural rights, and social contract theorists start to become more and more radical, so to speak, in their opposition against government abuses. Their material becomes inspiration for political revolutions in the Americas and throughout Europe. You have a DPQ on this, and we'll talk about this later. Reactions to the Enlightenment continued. Major Enlightenment thinkers were obviously men, and major Enlightenment-inspired governments like the French and American governments, excluded women from political power. Feminism was very much a response to this. They used and kind of weaponized the rhetoric of Enlightenment thought and Enlightenment thinking. Um, Feminism, just so we're clear, is that definition right there: the advocacy of women's rights on the basis of equality of the sexes. Um, and we'll see the Declarations of the Rights of Man and the French Citizen um, is a major Enlightenment-inspired political document that takes place during the French Revolution, and feminists, kind of create their own. And note that the Declaration of the Rights of Man and French Citizen leave out women, right? Please study this slide. Mary Wollstonecraft, she was the author of Frankenstein. She was a famous feminist as well. You can also see the Declaration of Sentiments. So, couching these important documents in feminism as declarations, very similar to like declarations of independence. This talk about rights and women's rights, very much in response to early Enlightenment thinkers and Enlightenment inspired politicians' um, non consideration of women's rights. The idea of rights and people having individual rights and individualism and this focused on humanism, um, encouraged abolitionism, which was a reform movement that aimed to abolish slavery. It also encouraged Zionism. I think everyone is familiar with the American Revolution, but the major colonists or causes were that the colonists were a great distance from Great Britain. They were unhappy with mercantilism, unhappy with being restricted into trading with Great Britain. Um, they were unhappy about the economic policies of Great Britain that taxed them, etc. They were also the American elite were steeped in Enlightenment thinking, and so they couched their political revolution in terms of, uh, you know, stopping the abuses of the king. One of the major causes of the American Revolution that I also forgot to mention was the unfair taxation that was linked to Great Britain's war debt. So Great Britain fought France in the French and Indian War, and they incurred a lot of war debt, and so they were taxing colonists to help pay for that, and colonists were not happy about that. I guess the French Revolution origin story starts with France's war debts. France had fought or had sided with the Americans, provided funding for the American Revolution, so that was very costly. With droughts damaging the French harvest and nobility scoffing at spending restrictions, King Louis the 14th needed to raise taxes, but to do that, he needed to get everyone on board. So in 1789, he called a meeting of the Estates Generales, a governing body that hadn't met in some 175 years. French society was divided into three estates. They're kind of like social classes. The first estate comprised the clergy. Some were high ranking and wealthy, others were parish priests and quite poor. The second estate was made up of the noble families, and the third estate, which comprised everyone else, peasant farmers and the small but influential middle class or bourgeois, including merchants. The overwhelming majority, more than 95% or 97% of the population, were members of the third estate, but they had very little political power. The representatives of the third estate, therefore, when they were summoned, they wanted greater political freedoms. They were inspired by the American Revolution. On June 1789, the Third Estate declared themselves the National Assembly. The king got nervous and forced the other two estates to join them in an effort to write a new constitution. But it was really too little too late. By then, peasants throughout the land were growing restless and were concerned that the king wasn't going to follow through on the major reforms they wanted. They stormed the Bastille, a huge prison in Paris, on June 14th, 1789. From there, anarchy swept through the countryside, and soon peasants attacked the nobility and feudal institutions. By August, the National Assembly adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man, a document recognizing natural rights and based on the ideas of the Enlightenment, the American Declaration of Independence, and particularly the writings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. This declaration was widely copied and distributed across Paris, furthering the ideas of freedom, equality, and the rule of law. The Assembly also abolished the feudal system and altered the monopoly of the Catholic Church by declaring freedom of worship. They weren't too radical, however. In 1799, they established a constitutional monarchy. More radical people like uh, the Jacobins were very upset by this, and they established a new convention and declared France a republic. The French Revolution is kind of a tale of, it's a more sad tale than the American Revolution. This kind of paranoia of anti-revolutionaries led to the Reign of Terror. Um, so the Committee of Public Safety was an all-powerful enforcer of the revolution and murderer of anyone suspected of anti-revolutionary tendencies. It was led by Maximilien Robespierre and the Jacobins. The Committee of Public Safety certainly wasn't a committee of personal safety, since it was responsible for the beheading of tens of thousands of French citizens. Even though the committee was successful at controlling the anarchy and at building a strong national military to defend France against an increasing number of invading countries, after 2 years the French had enough of Robespierre's witch hunt and put his head on the guillotine. France quickly reorganized itself again, wrote a new constitution in 1795, and established a new five-man government called the Directory, which Napoleon Bonaparte overthrows, and he becomes Emperor of France. So Napoleon Bonaparte kind of benefits from the chaos that exists in French society, and he leads a series of successful campaigns in France, but they don't last very long. He fails at invading Russia and is pushed back. Yeah, you can read the whole campaign in your Princeton Review Guide on page 233. I guess the thing you really have to understand is kind of like the French Revolution. The hope of the French Revolution is kind of, you know, doesn't materialize. The radicals that take over France are beheading people left and right, and then Napoleon Bonaparte essentially declares himself emperor of France after he overthrows the Directory, which had overthrown Maximilien Robespierre's Committee on Public Safety. And so there's just a lot of political turmoil in France after the French Revolution, and then the establishment of a dictatorship, which is what was trying to be avoided. Here's your first practice due today, April 20th, by 11:59 p.m. You're sourcing the following document. Remember where you can see my face in the bullhorn. That's what you're supposed to do when you source, right? A lot of you are breaking down the SOAP analysis. I don't necessarily want to see that. I want to see that in a body paragraph. Show me a body paragraph. Continue writing where those lines exist, so to speak. So the topic sentence / argument that I give you is: Enlightenment political philosophy informed and guided to a significant extent the political revolutions of the Enlightenment, especially the French and the American revolutions. So I would source the U.S. Declaration of Independence, where you see Enlightenment ideas. You see the Enlightenment idea of unalienable rights. That can come across in your sourcing by describing the occasion, maybe the fact the American Revolution is taking place shortly after the Enlightenment, or maybe describing the speaker. The speaker of, the authors of the U.S. Declaration of Independence were steeped in Enlightenment political philosophy, etc. And then explain how that sourcing is relevant to that topic sentence. And then I want you to include outside additional piece of specific historical evidence beyond that found in the document. So obviously, a lot of you have trouble with this one, or not obviously, but a lot of you have trouble with this. But you're supposed to include historical evidence found outside the document at least twice in your DBQ. So I'm trying to force you to do that by, in your topic synthesis argument, talking about the French Revolution. So I want you to integrate historical evidence about the French Revolution and then explain how that historical evidence supports that topic sentence / argument. The first successful Latin American revolt took place in Haiti, a French island colony in the Caribbean. The French, true to their mercantilist policies, exported coffee, sugar, cacao, and indigo from Haiti to Europe. French colonists owned large plantations and hundreds of thousands of slaves who grew and harvested these crops under horrible conditions. By 1800, 90% of the population was enslaved and working on large plantations. In 1801, as Napoleon was gaining momentum in Europe, Pierre Toussaint Louverture, a former slave, led a violent, lengthy, but ultimately successful slave revolt. Enraged, Napoleon sent 20,000 troops to put down the revolt, but the Haitians were capable fighters. They also had another weapon on their side, yellow fever, that claimed many French lives. So Columbian Exchange, maybe a historical analogy there. The French did succeed, however, in capturing Louverture and imprisoning him in France, but by then they couldn't turn back the revolutionary tide. Louverture's lieutenant, Jacques Dessalines, also a former slave, proclaimed Haiti a free republic in 1804 and named himself Governor General for life. Thus, Haiti became the first independent nation in Latin America. In 1808, when Napoleon invaded Spain, he appointed his brother Joseph Bonaparte to the Spanish throne. This sent the Spanish authorities in the colonies into a tizzy. Who should they be loyal to? The colonists decided to remain loyal to their Spanish king and not recognize the French regime under Bonaparte. In Venezuela, they ejected Bonaparte's governor and instead appointed their own leader, Simón Bolívar. Tutored on the republican ideals of Rousseau during his travels to Europe and the United States, Bolívar found himself in the midst of a great opportunity to use what he learned. In 1811, Bolívar helped establish a national congress which declared independence from Spain. Royalist supporters of the Spanish crown declared civil war. Bolívar proved to be a wily and effective military leader, and during the next decade he won freedom for the area called Gran Colombia, which included modern-day Colombia, Ecuador, and Venezuela. Bolívar envisioned a huge South American country spanning across the continent similar to the growing United States and North America, but it wasn't meant to be. In the following decades, the individual nation-states of northwestern South America formed their own governments. Meanwhile, farther south in Argentina, the conflict between the French governor and those who still wanted to support the Spanish crown created another opportunity for liberation. José de San Martín was an American-born Spaniard, or Creole, who served as an officer in the Spanish army. In 1814, he began to put his extensive military experience to use, but for the rebels, taking command of the Argentinian armies. San Martín joined up with the Bernardo O'Higgins of Chile and took the revolutionary movement not only through Argentina and Chile, but also to Peru, where he joined forces with Bolívar. The Spanish forces withered away. By the 1820s, a huge chunk of South America had successfully declared independence from Spain. These are the major revolutions. I would go back and look at some of the key Latin American revolutions, particularly the ones in Brazil and Mexico that I did not talk about yet. Please go back. They're on page 235 in your Princeton review. They have all these revolutions, I should say, stem from some form of social inequalities or are inspired by the Enlightenment or something unfair, and usually revolutions don't turn out to be the best means of remedying these or turn out to be an ideal society afterwards. So they all have problems afterwards. Some of the key unifications that take place during this period are the Italian unification and German unification. The Industrial Revolution was one of those transformative events in AP World History. Here's some of the context on how the Industrial Revolution begins. In particular, there's all kinds of new technologies. I would know maybe a couple of these, like the spinning jenny, just to have some stuff and cool facts that you could throw into your essay if it's about the Industrial Revolution. Interchangeable parts allowed for greater productivity. The Industrial Revolution to the mass production of goods. The division of labor is pretty cool. It leads to something called specialization. So I actually hate how it's defined there. That doesn't. But a division of labor is something along the lines of like your teachers all majored in something specific in college. I did not major in chemistry, so I'm not your chemistry teacher, and I wouldn't be a good chemistry teacher. Some of you have had me as your chemistry teacher for a day or two. It didn't go out well, did it? But I majored in, for lack of a better, for brevity, international relations and economics, and so I am a good fit for AP World History. I would be a really good fit for AP Government and Economics. But it wouldn't make sense, right? So, the whole idea behind specialization is more productive, right? So Mr. Blackcollar's good at chemistry, so he should major in chemistry. I'm good at economics and political science, so I should major in those courses. It wouldn't make sense if we both had the same schedule at our respective colleges, right? Because I want a completely different career path than he does. So that's what specialization is all about. It leads to productivity, etc. Great Britain's the first country to industrialize, and there's all kinds of theories why, so go ahead and take a look at the theories. Industrialization then really spreads across Europe and into the US, and then the first non-Western country that really industrializes is Japan. Japan does it almost as like a protection against Western incursions, particularly from imperialism, and we'll talk more about that next week. But industrialization really means industrial muscle, right? So let's think about that for a second. If you're able to produce more goods, that's not just exclusive to the economic sphere. You can produce more tanks and planes eventually, right? Obviously, tanks aren't a thing in this time, but they would become a thing eventually. So countries that industrialize first have kind of an upper hand, and countries that just didn't industrialize don't have that upper hand. So they have that muscle, they have that ability, and eventually this leads to them early industrializers being able to conquer the world. We're going to put a pin in the conquest of the world for now. We'll talk about European new imperialism next week, and actually Japanese imperialism as well. But for right now, we're going to stick to industrialization. So there's a lot of technological achievements in the industrial age. There's like the steam engine becomes really important during the early industrial revolution. The second industrial revolution, oil and steel production also becomes very important. Another thing I'll just also say, global trade and migration becomes more of a thing. Railroads become more widespread, telegraphs and communication. So definitely the industrial revolution unleashes an age of connectivity. Other countries begin to try to industrialize, and they sponsor, it's kind of like state-sponsored industrialization. This was actually one of the first essays that you wrote. It was an LEQ. So take a look at autumn industrialization. This slide, you would have to know these. Japanese industrialization is really interesting. It's interesting because it kind of gets at what takes place in the next unit, which is imperialism. So Japan kind of gets pushed around. In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry of the U.S. demanded Japan trade with the U.S., and Japan had to relent. They decide to undertake industrialization under the Meiji Restoration, and the idea was to adopt enough Western tech to protect its traditional culture, protect themselves. What do I mean by Western tech? Commodore Matthew Perry came on a steamboat, obviously a direct result of the Industrial Revolution. They used guns to threaten. So the Meiji Restoration, those are all the kinds of reforms. They reorganized the military and Army and Navy. They created a new school system, built railroads and roads, subsidized industrialization. The whole idea was to sponsor industrialization to protect Japanese culture, and it was very successful. I think it was a successful example, more successful than the Ottoman example. The Industrial Revolution ushers in this age of corporations. So before, a business used to be owned by a single person, so there are more small businesses. And then it kind of ushers this age of corporations where businesses are owned by numerous stockholders. So like Google is owned by hundreds of thousands of stockholders. All kinds of mega corporations today kind of owe their history to the Industrial Revolution, and actually really, joint stock companies in the age of exploration. The downside of being the sole owner of something is obviously you take a lot of risk. Um, you buying a share in several different corporations, especially it's going to be like a feature of a lot of your guys' retirement as you grow older. You take on less risk, right? Because if a corporation goes under and you only have one share in it, you helped fund that corporation, right, so to speak. But at the same time, you're not really financially at risk because it goes under. Industrialization's effect on mass culture, consumerism, you can see that becomes a more prominent fixture of industrialized societies. Before the Industrial Revolution, people were, let's just be honest, dirt poor and broke. They really didn't have the ability to consume things for leisure, like Louis Vuitton, or I don't know why I said Louis Vuitton. That's just one example. Also, advertisement. With the Industrial Revolution, people wanted to market. You can major in marketing in college. that largely originates, advertising largely originates with the Industrial Revolution. We did a lot of DBQs early last semester or late last semester on the good and negative of Industrial Revolution. The good being like produces more goods and services for society. The bad being poor working conditions, child labor. So obviously there's a lot of reform movements that stem from the Industrial Revolution, a lot of intellectual reactions as well. Growth of labor unions and child labor laws are really at the forefront of kind of like this pushback against industrialization and checking industrialization. Intellectual reaction, there's utilitarianism, which we've talked about, and Marxism, which is probably really, really, really important for AP World History, and I want you to know the theory. Or not just the theory, but like stuff about Karl Marx in general and his ideas. So much so, by the way, that I created a whole separate YouTube video on Marxism. So I'm going to include the highlights of that YouTube video here, but if you don't watch that, then I am going to, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm not going to do anything, but I'll be upset. So Karl Marx, although he, a lot of his ideas lead to the establishment of communist regimes in the 20th century, we are no longer going to talk about the establishment of those regimes because Units 7 through 9 are no longer going to be on the AP test of Karl Marx's grave, and there's graffiti on it. To find out why and my take on it, go to that Marxist YouTube video. Marxism is really a theory and an ideology. So theories try to explain the world in a more empirical, or not in a more objective sense, I would say, and an ideology is an action-oriented system of belief. And I'll explain why it's both. So the political and economic theories of the German political philosopher and economist Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, later developed by their followers to form the basis for the theory and practice of communism. Central to Marx's theory is an explanation of social change in terms of economic factors. They thought economics explained everything. According to which the means of production provide the economic base which influences and determines the political and ideological superstructure. Marx and Engels thought that communism was a kind of utopia, and that history proceeded towards a goal and an end state, and that goal was communism. History proceeded in a series of necessary stages. Those stages were marked by economic relationships, feudalism, capitalism, socialism, and then culminates in communism. Marx was very adamant that communism would be a utopian end state where everyone would be equal and the means of production would be owned collectively. Capitalists, who were viewed by Marx as very exploitative, who owned businesses privately and reaped all the benefits and exploited people's labor, capitalism would be abolished. Though Marx also concedes that capitalism is a necessary stage for communism to happen. That last line from the 11th Thesis on Feuerbach, philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it, emphasizes Marx's revolutionary and ideological tendencies. Marxism is really the best critique of capitalism today. A lot of those critiques are still relevant. So although communist systems are very inefficient, and take me for AP Economics if you want to find out why. Otherwise, for right now, just know that they are. Technology gets huge, and industrialists will invest. So one of the critiques of Marxism, or why Marx thought capitalism was doomed, was that technology gets huge, and industrialists will invest in tech instead of people. We see that with automation today. If you go to Walmart, for instance, you'll see that there's a lot of self-checkout lines instead of people. Capitalists, I guess, from a Marxist perspective, are it's cheaper to just create machines that do the self-check or the checkout for you. But Marx says that if every individual, I guess, company were to do this, then suddenly you have everybody out of work, and that's not a sustainable solution. He also said that capitalism was very morally flawed. The division of labor, which I talked about earlier, was problematic. I talked about it in terms of black collar and myself being divided into our specializations or like interests, and we therefore had different jobs. But division of labor can also be more problematic in the sense that, like, let's say you are a factory worker and your whole job is literally just to put maybe an eraser on a pencil, and you do that for the rest of your life. How boring and banal is that? So the division of labor can be problematic. Instead of you maybe taking more pride in what you do. He also said it was a very dehumanizing system. The commodification of our lives, this rush to commodification. I think in the Marxist YouTube video, I do talk about the Netflix series Maniac and the commodification that we see in that series. I will also say that in dystopian societies that we see in movies, film, and in books, they all are either critiques of capitalism or critiques of communism. So go ahead and go to the Marxist YouTube video. Just do that. So these two documents, just cite them both. Remember, citing is a little different. You just have to one sentence summary of the document and then one sentence explaining how it's relevant to the topic sentence. So the prompt I give you is a little disjointed from this body paragraph, and I think that's okay. So just remember you're supporting the topic sentence, that's argument here. So I think this got a little bit of cut off from the previous section, but go ahead and look at these. There are reform efforts in China that are kind of mixed. They center on China's conflict with European imperialism, and kind of this tension that exists in a lot of societies between, do we industrialize and are we contaminating ourselves by adopting Western tech, or do we reassert our cultures and values? So go ahead and read through that. This slide is all about resistance and limits to reform, so read through it. So what were the Industrial Revolution's effects? You can read through them here. We discussed them at length before. Environmental effects here. This is your DBQ that is due Friday. It's about the age of revolutions, and it's a causation essay. But I want you to incorporate as much outside information as you can. This essay I took from documents, a DBQ that existed, and I thought it was a lot harder because you would have to tell a lot more. You have to integrate a lot more outside evidence before I think you articulated a good essay. I'm going to go ahead and write one of these. I don't know if I'm going to do this on Saturday or maybe even Thursday or Friday. I'm going to write one live to help you see my thinking process, because I think that was a good exercise for me to do. If you need help, obviously call me, beat me if you want to reach me. But let's go, guys. I mean, we're not that far away from the test.